Alright everyone, I want to welcome you all back to some more short stories. Man, when I look back on, this game, we really have been through a lot. We've been through the main story, The House in Fata, A Requiem for Innocence, and now we're up to short stories. Only to continue onward to, Reincarnation. So I want to thank you all for following me through in this whole series, and up until the very end. And of course, guys, I want to thank you all for the continued support and love you have for this series because, if anything, you all know I have immense love for this series as well. So, continuing on from where we last left off, I can definitely tell you guys this one is going to be about Jacopo and Morgana. So, to those who are fans of those two, yep, this is a story for you. It's pretty heartfelt, pretty wholesome, some bitterness. I mean, it wouldn't be this kind of game without that theme, right? But hey. So we're going to continue on from there, guys, and without spoiling it, I'll let you guys see it through. So with that said, let's get to it. Alright everyone, we are kicking things off with The Revenant's Dream. Farewell, Jacopo, until our souls cross paths once more in the boundless sphere of fate. Goodbye, Morgana. She believed that was the end of it all. That by releasing their souls from their curse, they would all return to their rightful places. That the realm containing the cursed mansion would dissipate and the natural order of the world would take care of the rest. Both she and the good-hearted young man who had guided her to her salvation believed that. But the young man underestimated how strong his love was. And the girl underestimated how wholly and thoroughly he blamed himself. He sent her off, and then remained in place. He could not forgive himself for what he had done. And so he did not deserve to move on. The Revenant's Dream. The next thing she realized, she was in a field of gold. Wheat rolling in the wind like a golden ocean. The sky blue as sapphire. The breeze almost startlingly warm. It was an unbelievably gentle view, and one she did not recognize. She had never seen this place before, never been there before, yet looking out at it now, she felt emotional. It was almost terrifyingly beautiful. And as if drawn in by it, the girl took a step forward. With each subsequent step, the soft sound of crunching beneath her feet grew more distinct. Evidently, her soul had begun taking physical form, and it was her body from life that the golden ocean created for her. She raised her left arm, which had been severed before she was placed in captivity. It was whole. Still uncertain, she placed a hand on her cheek. There, she found none of the scars or the rough texture of the markings that had caused her so much torment in life. What's going on here? She was perplexed. Where was this place? When was it? And what was she doing here? In that form, no less. The girl continued walking in spite of her consternation, in spite of herself at that. It was the gentlest domains that had always caused her the most pain. The most pleasant memories were the sharpest knives. If her life had taught her one thing, it was that. And from then on, she had done everything in her power to eliminate those things. Which was why she had locked the warmly inviting master bedroom in the cursed mansion and threw the key into the painting. But now she was being drawn into another such realm. She felt as though she needed to push forward. And soon, as she approached the far edge of that wheat field, she caught sight of a figure. Seeing it, she stopped dead with a gulp. She knew what this world was. It was his world. Much like she had crafted her own realm to contain her curse, he too had built himself a world of illusion. Upon reaching this realization, a flood of images and memories rushed over her. But this was not unusual, as she had experienced projections of others' memories in the cursed mansion as well. And the dead perceived the world differently. The living and the dead perceived the world differently. For while the living were bound by their bodies, the dead were bound by recollections and emotions. Nonetheless, it had been Michelle, not her, who had dived into the memories directly. So this was her first time truly experiencing the phenomenon herself. Though she was uncertain as to whether the experience was intensified by her own involvement in these specific memories, they were of her as a child, of the young man applying ointment to her face every day for 3 years. She would claim it unnecessary, insult him, complain in any way she could, but still the young man came back the next day. Even on the day she fought to the point of truly angering him, he still applied the ointment. He was a strange man, she thought. For what purpose did he pay her so much mind? No other men wanted to get near her. The hideous scars covering her face was quite an effective deterrent, and most would probably cut off their own hands before volunteering to touch them. He alone was different, though. One day, he chastised her for making the trek to the graveyard every day in rain or snow or anything in between. But she realized now that his criticism applied to him as well. In the pouring rain or the midst of a blizzard, in the wind so strong they could knock a grown man to the ground, or even when he was hurt or sick himself, he never missed a day coming to find her at the graveyard. Next, she saw the rising sun, being carried on his back, traveling a different path home than the one she knew. The stench of decomposing flesh unavoidable in alleys of the slums. Her surroundings utterly repugnant, yet the sunrise oddly enchanting. The sun's light even reaches this deep, dark corner of the world. I mean, of course it does, but I don't know. For some reason, it seems particularly bright today. She said nothing in response, but she felt the same way. She had spent her whole life looking down at her feet, never taking the time to look up and appreciate the sky, and she likely never would have either. Never been able to see the beauty in the rising sun without a nudge. And subsequently, whenever the evil lord would show himself in her dreams, she was able to close her eyes and block him out, until eventually she was no longer able to remember his face or the sound of his voice. Her wounds were at last beginning to heal. He had given her so much: an ordinary life, an ordinary happiness, the freedom from having to be special, and warmth she had never before known. Ah, but those memories only served to salt her wounds. Every image of the slave boy showing her kindness was another crack in her foundation. I can't. He killed me. With the same hands he had used to treat her wounds, he later took her life. It tainted all her memories, shattered the illusion of warmth, ruined her all the way down to her soul, turned everything into hatred and anger, a fury so intense that even the young man's unconditional love was insufficient to assuage it. The only reason she had managed to maintain her composure at the very end was because Michelle was there with her, holding her hand. She would not have gone to see him at all otherwise. But now she was alone, so she would leave. She had no interest in seeing that man again, and when she made to head back the way she had come, she caught a glance at the shadowy figure's condition. It was beaten and broken, crumbling away. She looked down in silence on the shadow, which barely maintained its own form. She had seen souls decay to this state before, such as Michelle's when he arrived at the mansion after centuries lost, broken down and reformed again and again, with only Giselle's voice as his guide. By the time he had found his way there, he was unrecognizable. Hardly a wisp of a spirit incapable of individual thought, blindly following Giselle's lead. She understood why Michelle's soul had taken so much damage. He had been abused and mistreated to an unimaginable degree his entire life. It made sense that he would wish for an ending more permanent than even death. But him... What are you doing so broken? She could not understand what had brought him to this point. He was the perpetrator, a monster. No matter how kind he had been to her before, that did not change what he had done after that. So what did he think he was doing, looking so mangled and beaten? If she left him there, before long his soul would disappear for good. Rubbed out of existence, never to return to the boundless sphere of fate. Good. Let him. She bit her lip. Yes, let him. Then she would be free of his torture once and for all. She would never have to see him again. Never have to torment herself with thoughts of him. And what a relief that would be. So she tried to turn back, but her body would not let her. An emotion she didn't understand had welled up in her breast. It was a pity, though she could not put a name to it herself. It was an emotion she had never felt during her time as the witch. And in fact, were the witch here, she would have cackled joyously at the sight, pointing a skeletal figure at the pathetic thing he had become and telling him how much he deserved it. But she was no longer that witch. And furthermore, she had been blessed with unconditional love by Michelle and Giselle, and the benevolent portion of her soul, which she had rent from herself to create the white-haired girl, was beginning to return to its rightful place. She thought she heard a voice from within, telling her that only she could save him. She frowned. Why should she have to save him after all the pain and suffering he had caused her? The voice within spoke. Michelle had stepped forward to save her after all the pain and suffering she had put him through. Giselle too held no grudge after being imprisoned in the mansion by her for centuries, happily joining Michelle in his quest. She took a single step forward. The wheat swayed as she did, making the scene even more dreamlike. Initially, she had been irritated to find him here, trying to hide from his sins in this realm of illusion. But now, she was beginning to realize that was not the case. His memories and feelings flowed over her, with more clarity this time. This was what he could have had if he had not made all those mistakes, and this was the place he had hoped to show her one day. He was not hiding from his sins. He was attempting to atone for them. He had condemned his sins, lamented his failures, and forced himself to look at his vision of a world he had let slip through his fingers, again and again until it had destroyed his soul. This was his punishment for himself. And not only for what he had done to Morgana, but her other half, the white-haired girl as well. She had said in a letter that she wished to see his homeland, and he had failed to see that through as well. Twice he had broken what he was supposed to care about most. Twice he had crushed her, and he could never forgive himself for that, not even after she had released him from her curse. You truly are the biggest fool in all the world. She had never in all her time seen more of a disaster of a man, though she was beginning to realize that part of the reason he had done this to himself was because she had rejected his offer to make amends, told him she would not punish him any further. Not to mention, he was not entirely at fault for his actions in his second life. She had wished to see his life in ruins. She had, in a sense, placed him on that path herself. But he was not the one who could place the blame for his actions on others. Everything was always his responsibility and his alone. He was like that in his first life, and his second, and in the illusory alternate scenario where Michelle intervened. Ultimately, I'm the one responsible, he said on their march to atonement. And I suppose to make sure their next lives go a little better, he said, excluding himself from any potential redemption. So what though? That doesn't change what he did. Are you saying I should have sent him off with a smile? That I should have set aside my hatred to make the man who hurt me feel better? She took another step toward the amorphous shadow, still unsure of her own position. The closer she got, the more she wanted to run away. What would she say? What would she do? She had not an inkling of an idea. Not a single fully formed thought about what came after this. The shade noticed her, lifting its head. She tensed up. It was hideous, hardly even recognizable as a human. But she could tell somehow that it was smiling at her. It must have been made up of all the things he had wanted to do for her, she thought. The shade seemed to think she was part of the illusion. In that case, she thought, she could just play along with it. Pretending she was another phantom in this dreamscape would reduce the pressure on her, giving her time to think. Though in truth, she likely wanted to indulge in that fantasy herself. The long-lost possibility of nothing going wrong, of him finding their homeland. Even knowing it was all a sham, an insignificant sliver of a dream, she probably still wanted to partake in its warmth. And maybe then, she would be able to give him a genuine smile. So, what's on the agenda for the day? Initially, she had only intended to play along with the illusion, but in time she found herself being drawn into the dream world as well. A fantasy where he had never become the Lord, she never the witch, and the both of them lived uneventful lives in their undiscovered homeland. It was pleasant and peaceful, and she soon began enjoying it in earnest. She had turned off her mind, simply started accepting things as they had happened, which she was only able to do because he was hardly recognizable as him. She felt like she had really gone back to being a 16-year-old girl, like she had grown up a normal life not filled with tragedy. And, oh, how wonderful that would have been if it could have been true. He asked her to sing for him, so she brought him into a shade of a large tree. He told her he had borrowed a lute, but he held nothing in his amorphous hand, so she merely played along. In his vision of this realm, there were others like us for him to borrow from. They sat down in the shade of a tree and sang, only her voice to carry the tune. Like Michelle in the same condition, the shade was barely able to produce any coherent sound, let alone music. But still, she could tell what he was trying to say and how he was saying it. The longer she spent in the realm of illusion, the more her own state of mind reverted to those days. The 3 years when she had been able to experience happiness like anyone else, but continuing until she reached the age of 16. She was smiling and laughing, though she hardly realized it herself. Nor did she recall that she had explicitly told him previously that she could not smile for him. In time, she even found herself able to speak of her younger days, something she had not told him even in life. How she was known as the saint, how her blood had miraculous powers, and the people of her village began worshipping her for it. She had on some level wanted to talk about that with him in life, wanted to open herself up to him more, wanted him to know more of who she really was. You're just an ordinary girl. He spoke in an earthly voice, like thousands of rocks scraping against one another. But to her ears, it was the sound of a young slave man's voice, his slightly exasperated, always gentle tone. She smiled. You've said as much so many times now, I'm almost beginning to believe it, she said, wondering if he would have been the one to give her warmth if things had gone differently. Obviously, that was but a hypothetical future, and one they could have never reached, no less. But she had softened up enough to entertain such silly fantasies. She also thought about her homeland. Not the small, isolated village where she had been born, but someplace farther up her bloodline, her real father's home. Would you like to meet him? She was telling him of her father when he suddenly asked her that. She was not sure, and she racked her brain in consideration. It was not something she really needed to think about. There was no family here for her to find any more, after all, but she had indulged herself so deeply in the past that reality was not a concern. She spoke of her father with a hint of sadness in her voice, to which the shade responded with a sudden surge of rage. The whole dreamscape warped around him, and a metallic smell of blood permeated the region. He wanted to seek out her father and mete out divine justice, and the world twisted to fit his image. Any form of violence is forbidden, she shouted, attempting to calm his fury. Not even if it's for my sake, she continued. Anytime he had managed to obtain any form of power, it had led him down the path of destruction. He knew no other way to wield it. And because doing so had shown to be effective in accomplishing his immediate goals, he had never bothered to look for any other solutions, which ultimately resulted in him being unable to trust anyone, because he only understood power as a blunt object. He was soft, cowardly man deep down, but because he learned to kill, I don't want you to hurt anyone else ever again. The more he hurt others, the more he hurt himself. This was a lesson that was long, long overdue for him. The shadow stared at her in silence for several minutes, as the blood and fiery rage twisting the illusory realm slowly receded. When it was gone, the shade too seemed to have returned to normal, nodding and saying, "All right, I won't." She let out a sigh of relief. She had slipped entirely back into her childhood. They talked more about everything and nothing, such as the midsummer festival, the memory of which filled her with yearning for those times, when everyone was still together. Him, his friend Maria, his companion Gratian, and the eternally cheerful Jaren. She was never terribly fond of gatherings of that many people, and that had not changed even now, but she was able to reminisce about it and admit that it had not been entirely awful, that it had been an important formative moment of her youth, and probably the same for the rest of them as well. The three girls holding hands and dancing in a circle, him playing a tune on the lute and his friend providing a beat. It was a marvelous day. As she reflected, she realized he had been chasing overly ambitious dreams from the very beginning. All his talk of going out into the world and taking her with him. And he was no different here in this realm of illusion. Eventually, she grew tired of hearing his fantasies, telling him, "Climb down off your high horse and adjust." If he was going to keep chasing after stupid dreams, she would laugh at him every time. If he was going to keep chasing after impossible ideals, she would drag him back down to earth. That way, he would never. Then I'd just have to find a new dream. Excuse me? Her mouth hung open in a mix of exasperation and shock, and perhaps a trace of anger. She wanted to shout, tell him how all his idiotic dreams ended with him in shambles, but he seemed unable to pick up on her trepidation, continuing unfazed. "I'm going to win your heart." She stood aghast. That was the last thing she had ever expected to hear from him. Even knowing his whole world was his fantasy about what he wished he could have done for her, she was conflicted. She felt many things, but flattered was a line she would never cross. No matter how much she had reverted to her younger self here, her present self still remained. "You murdered me. There's nothing you can do to win my heart, not a single thing." She found herself very close to saying what she felt, but she set her agitation aside to let the dream continue a bit longer, for her own peace of mind more than his. From that point, he became almost impressively brazen, even asking her to call him by his name, to which she frowned and said, in no uncertain terms, "Why would I waste my breath?" visibly disheartening him. After some time having to watch him mope, she could bear it no longer and attempted to raise a new subject. But whether she asked him about learning to play the lute or going fishing together, the only response she received was a half-hearted nod. She sighed at a complete loss, and then the shadow spoke. "Will you say my name?" Again. Why was he so fixated on such a stupid, insignificant thing? But as he continued, she realized his request was more pitiful and heartfelt than she had ever heard from him. "I don't want you to forget," she gasped. "I don't want you to forget me again." Cracks developed in the shadow. I don't want you to forget what I look like. It wavered, shook, crumbled. The sound of my voice. But still, he pleaded desperately. Or how I feel about you. The man who refused to lean on anyone was begging for her validation. I don't want you to forget what we talked about. They were all things she had long since forgotten about him. What kind of man I was. Things she had locked away in the deepest recesses of her mind. Or all the time we shared together. Memories overflowing with so much warmth they hurt. Please. She cast it all out. His name, his face, his everything. Don't forget me. Which was all that allowed her to mistake him for the Lord. She felt a chill listening to the shade beg and plead endlessly. What was she supposed to do here? At the very least, this meant the end of the peaceful, trouble-free illusion. Why would you ask me that now? She said, her voice strained. I was hoping to. She was hoping to bask in the illusion a while longer. The shadow said nothing. It simply sat there, waiting for her answer. She mulled over the question for a while, then took another step toward it. She was close enough to touch it now, but she would never do that. A feeling welled up in her breast, a mixture of wanting to scream, burst into tears, and throw things around like a small child. She forced it back, looking down the shade. If I had remembered, would anything have been any different? Could we have not ended up so far down the wrong path? If I'd gone and found you, would that have stopped you from becoming what you did? There were 1,000 things she could have done differently. If, after taking up at the cottage and on the lake, she had gone into town even once, she could have found out they had a new lord. Maybe he was the one who had sent that knight to visit her cottage, who she had sent away without talking to. Not to mention, if she had only told him about her childhood, the rumors about her blood having healing powers, he would have been able to make the connection between her and the lakeside witch. If she had done something, maybe she could have stopped him from veering off the straight and narrow. In fact, she was likely the only person who could have stopped him. Why am I blaming myself for his mistakes? He's the only one responsible for his choices. She did not know what to do. She had been at a loss ever since learning the truth. The answers had only brought her more pain. And so she had buried them away somewhere out of sight. Ah, that must be why. That must have been why she had not yet returned to her rightful place. While she had been brought into salvation by the hands of an angel, ceased being the witch, the girl inside was as wounded and suffering as ever. Can I hold your hand? The shade resumed its pleading. Its desperation clawed at her chest. And so, rather than coolly denying the request, she found herself saying, "Do as you please." The shadow slowly extended its hand up to hers, as if scared. It was not playing its part very well. This was supposed to be a dream where nothing had gone wrong between them after all. But the illusion had begun to give way to harsh reality. The reality of having murdered the girl he loved. The reality of having been brutally abused and killed by the man she had leaned on for support. They had both once cared for each other in a very similar way. Yet the end result was not love, but terrible tragedy. He was terrified to show someone affection with hands that had only ever brought destruction. And so before he did, he said, "I promised I wouldn't touch you without permission." She knew it was just an excuse, though, that he was simply afraid, worried about putting his bloodied hands on her, that he might hurt her again, that he might corrupt her, that he had no right to. But he overcame all that, gently placing his arms around her, as if he had been waiting centuries for this moment. It was an embrace of many things: love for her, deep regret, and, most of all, atonement. He's wanted to do this. In his arms, she could feel everything he felt. Since the day I locked his soul in that mansion, she thought back to that time. The unfathomable amount of time she spent as the witch, a force of pure hatred and vengeance. His was the last soul she entrapped, and when she did, he was a little more than an amorphous shadow. It took many, many years for him to regain a human form, but even then, he was unable to move or speak. He simply wailed something incomprehensible at her again and again. At the time, I thought he was saying how much he hated me. But she was wrong. He had simply wanted to atone. But he had no idea how. Look at you, a grown man shaking like a fawn. As the shadow embraced her, it trembled, sobbing loudly into her shoulder. She had never seen him cry before, though she was unsure if this counted, since she could only feel it through the nebulous shade. Sometimes I can't tell if you have a heart or a stone of glass. Her entire body went limp. All the tension in her nerves released at once, and she felt like a massive weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Though, I suppose I'm not terribly different in that regard. Unable to even speak my heart unless there's no one else around. Unable to face you except through this childish fantasy. Not even able to show any vulnerability. Maybe. She hated to even entertain the thought, but perhaps they were more similar than she wanted to admit. Some time long ago, in the memory she had banished away, he told her that being close made people more open with each other, and it turned out he was right about that. She began to speak, to tell him the truth of how she felt, letting spill forth the raw pain within, holding nothing back. She told him how she despised him more than anything in the world, because he showed her happiness, then the depths of despair, that she had no idea what to do with him, how she did regret some of her actions, such as misdirecting her anger. He was consumed by regret over what he had done to her, but he was not the only one who had regrets. As their minds and spirits intermingled, the true shape of her wounds grew apparent. He had hurt her, but she had hurt him too. She had blamed him not only for his own sins, but the sins of another man as well, and for that, she had laughed at him, cursed him, mocked him for trying to show something resembling care for another human being, again and again and again and again and again and again and again. I should have known better than anyone how much he was capable of caring, though. She thought back to the decisive moment. Knowing the truth now, she finally understood the full effect of the things she had said, to an even greater degree than Michelle had told her. She had told the man who had spent 3 years looking after her, coming to apply ointment to her scarred face, rain or snow, that she despised him with all her soul, that he had ruined her life. She had not been seeing clearly at the time, but he had been teetering on the edge as well. And her saying that had been the final push. It was my words that ultimately pushed you over the edge, wasn't it? How had it all ended up like this? Why did they have to hurt each other so much? What was the turning point that sent them so far off the path? He continued holding on to her for some time, pleading for a chance to make amends, spilling his heart, clinging to her like a little child. It was something he could never have done in life, or even in death. It was only after repeatedly crushing himself beneath overwhelming regret until he was mangled and hardly recognizable that he was able to show her his weakness, that he was able to show her his tears. But it was far too late. It was all over. Nothing he asked for was something she could give him. No matter how much he begged, she could never stop hating him, could never forgive him. Fissures began to form in her spirit. Memories of her youth brought with them emotions long lost, of the time she first directly acknowledged his kindness. It was bitter, sweet, agonizing, suffocating, innocent feeling. Many, many ages ago, when I was still a child, I looked up to you. The sunrise she saw that morning carried on his back only seemed as beautiful as it did because he had shown it to her. She then grew to yearn the lost homeland he spoke of, admire his lofty dreams, and feel warmth in his hands as he spread the ointment. That was when the seed was planted, not only of the ability to feel joy, but love as well. I might have even had some fondness for you. And having said that, she noticed the clear droplets rolling down her cheeks. After Michelle finished unveiling the truth, she shouted, "I cried for him," in a frenzy, and those tears she had shed contained all her feelings for him. On the day of her 12th birthday, that terrible tragic day, she cried and told the man in the slave cart, "I'm sad because I didn't get the chance to show my gratitude to the people very dear to me." And that was true. She was grateful to not only the young slave man, but the girls of the brothel as well. She had wanted to open up to them, but the larger portion of her tears were for just one person. She cried for him. She cried for the man who had spent so long trying to help her. She cried because she had not been able to thank him. She cried because she believed him to be dead. She cried for him then. So who did she cry for now? Were these tears for him as well? Were they for herself? No. They were for both of them. She decided to let the illusion continue on a while longer. She knew it was foolish. She had mixed feelings about being here and interacting with him as she had when she was younger. But she had softened up enough to not simply ignore the warmth it also made her feel. She had found it in herself to accept the seed of kindness sprouting within her. She had found it in herself to acknowledge how he felt. So she would use the dream to lead him to his next destination, under the guise of him holding her hand and leading her. Out of the claws of this foolish fantasy to be released once and for all. she would guide him back into the void, the boundless sphere of fate, so that he may live again. They set off through the fields of waving gold. She squeezed her eyes shut, envisioning the young man she once knew, and when she opened them again, he was there holding her hand and smiling softly at her. You know, Jacopo, I really hope we don't ever cross paths again. Nothing good could possibly come from us meeting in the next life. I'm tired of having to deal with you. I hate you, and I pray I never have to see you again. But should you wish to see me, ask should that wish take priority over my own. Promise you'll treat me well. And if you can manage that, then I... Okay, that was an interesting part of the story. So it takes place right after the main storyline ends, where everyone gets reborn, I assume. So it goes into how Jacopo would actually, his spirit would have dissipated and not reached the sphere of fate, where they get reborn. If Morgana wasn't there to like help lead him back into the void. So that was interesting. Okay, I like that. That was actually pretty long too. I was surprised. That really was a half-hour story. But if anything else, guys, I'm gonna have to end it here for today. Thank you all for watching. When we come back, we're gonna continue on with a Scarlet in the Coffee House. So thank you all for watching.